Racism remains a pervasive and deeply ingrained issue across the globe, and Indians are no exception to this harsh reality. Whether it manifests as subtle microaggressions, systemic discrimination, or overt acts of hostility, Indian people across different parts of the world face varying levels of racial prejudice. This reality exists not only in countries known for their multicultural environments, but also in places that pride themselves on inclusivity. In 2024, Indians continue to encounter racism in many countries around the world, and the ratio of discrimination faced by Indians globally is an alarming one, with many Indian immigrants, students, and professionals being subjected to racial biases and inequality in their daily lives. In this examination, we will dive deeper into the experiences of Indians living in the 10 countries where racism is most prevalent, how racial prejudice is expressed in each of these regions, and the ongoing efforts being made to combat this pervasive issue. Part number 10 is Italy. In Italy, racism against Indian migrants is often tied to broader anti-immigrant sentiments that have been a part of the country's political discourse for years. Many Indians in Italy, especially those from rural backgrounds, work in low-status jobs such as agriculture, cleaning, or construction. These sectors often subject workers to both institutional and social discrimination. Indians in Italy, particularly those living in economically disadvantaged or rural areas, find themselves segregated from the local community and frequently experience derogatory stereotypes. The general perception of Indians as permanent outsiders makes it difficult for them to assimilate, leading to social exclusion and discrimination. This prejudice manifests through racist jokes, verbal abuse, and even physical violence. Though the Indian diaspora in Italy is small but growing, their economic struggles are compounded by the racial discrimination they face, making life difficult for many. The number 9 is Germany. Germany, a country renowned for its economic strength and commitment to open borders, has not been immune to issues surrounding race. Despite the country's reputation for inclusivity, Indians, though not among the largest immigrant groups, frequently face discrimination, particularly in the workplace and in educational settings. As political movements on the far right gain traction in the country, anti-immigrant sentiment has also seen a rise. This climate of racial hostility has led to increased prejudice against non-European immigrants, including Indians. In Germany, Indian immigrants report facing racial profiling, being subjected to negative stereotypes, and sometimes even enduring physical violence. These challenges are particularly evident in the workplace, where Indians are often stereotyped as hardworking but lacking in intellectual capability or leadership qualities. Nonetheless, the Indian community in Germany remains resilient, with Indians making significant contributions to the nation's economy, particularly in the fields of technology and academia. Number 8 is United Arab Emirates, UAE. The United Arab Emirates, UAE, hosts a large Indian expatriate population, many of whom work in low-wage sectors such as construction and hospitality. Although the UAE is known for its modern and cosmopolitan image, the reality for many Indian workers is far from glamorous. These workers often face exploitation, poor working conditions, especially in the labor market, and Indian expatriates are frequently relegated to segregated housing with limited access to healthcare and other public services. The country's kafala system, which governs foreign workers' rights, exacerbates their vulnerability as it allows employers to confiscate workers' passports and subject them to various forms of exploitation. While some Indians find success in white-collar jobs or in business, they still encounter prejudice in social and workplace environments. South Asians, including Indians, are often expected to occupy lower tier roles despite their qualifications and skills. Um, Number 7 is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, has a large population of Indian expatriates, many of whom work in sectors like construction, domestic labor, and other low-paying jobs. The kingdom has long been a destination for Indian workers, but the treatment of these workers reflects deep-seated racial hierarchies. Indians, along with other South Asians, often face poor living conditions, low wages, and mistreatment from employers. These issues are compounded by the country's kafala sponsorship system, which limits the rights of foreign workers and makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Many Indian workers in Saudi Arabia are seen as second-class citizens, subjected to racial discrimination in housing, workplaces, and daily life. Though there have been efforts from the Indian government to protect nationals abroad, the exploitative system in Saudi Arabia perpetuates significant racial inequalities that many workers struggle to overcome. Mhm. And number 6 is South Africa. Um, South Africa's troubled racial history, particularly the legacy of apartheid, has left lasting scars on the country's racial relations. Indians in South Africa, especially those of South Asian descent, have faced discrimination due to their historical role as indentured laborers. Um, South Africa, despite forming a significant portion of the population, many Indians in South Africa are still viewed with prejudice, particularly by the larger Black African population, which sometimes sees them as complicit in the legacy of apartheid. This historical context of racial tension has resulted in incidents of violence against Indian-owned businesses, as well as exclusion in employment. Though the South African government has implemented affirmative action policies to address historical racial inequality, the deep divides in the nation's racial fabric remain evident. Indians, particularly in areas like KwaZulu-Natal, often feel caught between the legacy of apartheid and the ongoing economic and racial disparities that persist in post-apartheid South Africa. Number 5 is Russia. Racism in Russia is often tied to a general xenophobia against non-Slavic ethnic groups, and Indians, along with other Asians, are frequently subjected to racial discrimination. Indians in Russia are often viewed as outsiders and are subjected to verbal abuse, racial violence, and social exclusion. The media often perpetuates negative stereotypes about Indians, particularly by associating them with criminal activity or portraying them as individuals. In larger cities like Moscow, many Indians work in small businesses or as laborers, where discrimination can be overt. Instances of violent attacks against Indian students and workers are not uncommon. While the Indian community in Russia continues to grow, the challenges of racism hinder full integration into Russian society. Despite these obstacles, the Indian business community in Russia has cultivated cultural and economic ties, but racism remains a significant issue for many Indians trying to make a life in the country. Number 4 is Canada. Canada is often celebrated for its diversity and multicultural policies, but racial discrimination against Indians persists, particularly for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Many Indian immigrants in Canada report feeling marginalized, especially when it comes to housing and employment. Indian Canadians are often stereotyped as either model minorities or as threats, particularly during times of political unrest. The rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric, especially during election cycles, further fuels the perception that Indians are outsiders. Many Indians in Canada experience microaggressions in social settings or workplace discrimination that impedes their career advancement. Despite these challenges, Indian Canadians have made notable strides with a significant presence in politics, business, and cultural life. Um, with one, organizations like the Canadian Council of South Asian Organizations continue to work towards promoting inclusion and addressing systemic racism and economic inequality. Oh, hmm. Number three is United Kingdom, UK. Indians have been integral to the history and culture of the United Kingdom, contributing significantly to the economy and cultural diversity. However, many Indian immigrants continue to face racism, both subtle and overt. Discrimination in housing, employment, and education is prevalent, with many Indians subjected to racial profiling and microaggressions. South Asian communities, particularly those from India, often feel the effects of white British cultural dominance, which can lead to exclusion from social activities and limited job opportunities. Um, High pressure incidents, such as the 2017 terror attacks in Manchester and London, resulted in members of the Indian community being unfairly associated with these events, increasing feelings of insecurity. Despite ongoing efforts to combat racism, the persistence of class divisions and economic inequalities within the Indian diaspora makes it difficult to achieve full social inclusion. Number two is Australia. Australia has a complicated racial history, and Indians, particularly students and temporary workers, have been targeted by racist attacks and discrimination in recent years. Indian students, especially in cities like Melbourne, have reported experiencing racial assaults, particularly in the late 2000s during a time of heightened racial tension. Indians in Australia are often stereotyped as outsiders, and this marginalization extends to exclusion in social settings and discrimination in public spaces. The media frequently portrays Indians negatively, feeding into broader anti-immigrant sentiment. Despite these challenges, Indian Australians have contributed greatly to the country's economy and cultural landscape. Advocacy groups like the Indian Student Association have been working hard to combat these racial issues, pushing for policies that promote inclusion and tackle racial inequality. Number one is United States, USA. Racism in the United States has a long and complex history, and Indians, especially immigrants and their descendants, continue to face racial discrimination despite being one of the most successful immigrant groups. Indians in the US often experience stereotyping, racial profiling, hate crimes, and workplace discrimination. These biases are exacerbated by political rhetoric, particularly in times of heightened xenophobia or national crises. A notorious example is the 2017 Kansas shooting, where an Indian engineer was killed by a gunman who mistook him for a Middle Eastern person. Such incidents, though not widespread, are a stark reminder of the underlying prejudices that persist. Indians in the US also face systemic racism in areas like employment and education, which continues to create barriers to assimilation. Nevertheless, Indian Americans have been resilient, actively engaging in advocacy and policy reform to combat racial discrimination and push for legislative changes aimed at curbing hate crimes and ensuring equal employment opportunities. In conclusion, while Indians have made significant contributions to the countries they have migrated to, racism remains a persistent and challenging issue that continues to hinder their full integration into society. Efforts to combat this racism are ongoing, with many advocacy groups working tirelessly to promote equality, inclusivity, and systemic change. However, the road to achieving racial harmony and equality is long, and many Indians around the world continue to face barriers in their personal and professional lives. So,